Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving deep into the Amazon for a story about a fascinating clash of worldviews. It's about a missionary's journey to save a people that ended up challenging the very foundations of his own beliefs.
So this was the plan for Christian missionary Daniel Everett when he and his family packed up and headed into the Amazon rainforest way back in 1977. His whole mission? To bring what he saw as the saving message of the gospel to a very small, very isolated community. He was there to convert to Pirahã, an indigenous community of hunter-gatherers. But what he found was a way of looking at the world so completely different from his own, it would end up putting his entire faith on trial.
Okay, so let's get into this. Everett wasn't exactly the first person to try. He was walking into a situation with a really long history of failure. For over 200 years, missionaries had come and gone, completely unable to convert the Pirahã. One group back in the 18th century even called them recalcitrant, which is a fancy way of saying stubborn or uncooperative. But still, Everett was sure he was the one God had called to finally break through.
Now, to really get why every single attempt failed, we have to understand how the Pirahã live, and more importantly, how they think. You see, their entire culture is built on one simple principle, a principle that would make the Christian message basically impossible to accept.
And the contrast here as well, it's pretty staggering. The Pirahã lived in a community with no real hierarchy. They only worked about 15 hours a week, and they shared everything. Everett actually said they were some of the happiest people he'd ever met. They didn't even have a word for worry. Now compare that to a belief system that's really centered on ideas of sin and salvation in an afterlife. It's like two different planets.
And get this focus on what's real and right in front of you wasn't just a lifestyle choice. It was literally hardwired into their language. Their whole way of communicating was designed to only talk about direct, literal knowledge. That meant they didn't even have words for a lot of abstract ideas that we just take for granted.
This all boils down to a fascinating linguistic concept called evidentiality. Basically, in the Pirahã language, you can't just say something. The grammar itself makes you explain how you know what you're saying.
So every single verb had to have a special ending, a suffix that spelled out your source. Did you see it yourself? Did somebody who was there tell you about it? Or did you figure it out from the clues left behind? This little rule made them, in Everett's own words, the ultimate empiricists.
And, well, you can probably guess where this is going. This strict, evidence-based way of talking created a huge, huge problem when Everett tried to tell them the story of Jesus.
When Everett finally started sharing the gospel, the Pirahã didn't react with faith or wonder. Nope, they just started asking the same kind of practical, down-to-earth questions they'd ask about anything else they were trying to understand.
And he had to be honest. Of course, that's where the trouble started. He tried to explain that he'd never seen Jesus because Jesus had lived a very, very long time ago.
See, the Pirahã were just trying to fit his story into their world, into their grammar. If he didn't see Jesus, then okay, he must have heard it from an eyewitness, right? Like his dad. That was the only other way a claim like that could be true.
And this is the question that changes everything. When Everett admitted that no, he hadn't seen Jesus, and no, his dad hadn't either, and in fact, nobody he knew had ever seen him, the Pirahã were just confused. For them, a story without any first-hand evidence wasn't a lie. It just wasn't worth talking about. It had no value.
He even got creative. He had a Pirahã speaker record a translated Gospel of Mark onto a tape recorder, but they were met with the exact same simple and frankly devastating logic. They just listened and asked, okay, but did that guy see Jesus? The answer, of course, was still no.
Over the many years he lived with them, Everett's whole perspective started to flip. He saw a community that took care of each other, shared everything, and faced real hardship with laughter. They were already living out the very virtues his religion preached, but they were doing it without any of the guilt or fear of hell that came with it.
That relentless, simple skepticism didn't just bounce his message off, it turned it right back on him. Their constant demand for evidence forced him to look at his own beliefs through their eyes, and eventually it led to a total collapse of his faith. The missionary had been deconverted.
Now, this whole story is pretty incredible, and it might sound like some unique, one-off thing. But it turns out it's actually an echo of a much, much older conversation between Europeans and indigenous thinkers.
Let's go back to the 1680s, hundreds of years before Everett's journey. A French aristocrat wrote down his conversations with a real Wendat statesman and brilliant thinker named Kondiaronk, who he called a Dario in his book. And the parallels? They're just striking.
Adario's arguments against Christian dogma sound incredibly modern. He pointed out that the Bible was full of contradictions. He noted how it caused violent wars between different Christian groups, like the French and the English. And he asked these really sharp questions, like, if God is all-powerful, why would he talk in such a confusing way that it leads to thousands of different interpretations? And here's his core point, and it's so powerful. He basically argued for reason and intellectual freedom. He's saying he was meant to believe what he could understand with his own mind, not what was just handed to him as unquestionable dogma.
And here's the kicker. This wasn't just some forgotten debate. The book with Adario's arguments became a massive bestseller in Europe. In fact, many scholars now believe it was one of the key texts that helped spark the French Enlightenment.
So, why does this matter so much? Because these intellectual challenges from indigenous skeptics like Adario weren't just side notes in history, they were a major force. These ideas spread across Europe and forced philosophers to wrestle with really deep questions about religious authority, truth, and the power of human reason. As the book The Dawn of Everything puts it so well, these thinkers went right after the core assumption of European society, this arrogant idea that the Church's beliefs were just naturally superior to everyone else's. They offered a powerful outside perspective that helped shake the very foundations of that medieval certainty.
This whole history suggests that some of our most cherished modern values, things like secular rationalism and religious freedom, they didn't just pop up out of nowhere in Europe. They were, in part, reignited by these powerful intellectual challenges from the outside world. And that leaves us with a really important question to think about today. If reason and skepticism have such deep roots in indigenous thought, what else can we learn from cultures that we have for far too long simply ignored?